Hello and welcome to the Omnex webinar, Net Zero and Carbon Neutrality Standards for Now Your Environmental Management Systems. Today's presenter is Chad Keimel. Chad Keimel is the CTO of Omnex, an international consulting and training organization headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the United States. Chad has written many international papers for integrating social responsibility and sustainability with quality, environmental, and safety for the American Society for Quality. Chad also specializes in integrated management systems and risk analysis for social responsibility. Chad is a U.S. expert on the writing committee for documented information ISO standard 10013, as well as ISO 26262 for functional safety, ISO 9001 for quality management systems, ISO 14001 for environmental management systems, and ISO 45001 for health and safety management systems. During this webinar, if you have any questions for Chad, please enter them in the Q&A box, and he will get to them to the best of his ability at the end of the webinar. Please note there are some poll questions during this webinar. When the polls pop up, please answer them as quickly as possible, and we will move on with the webinar. All right, Chad, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Miles. Welcome, everyone. I think, thank you for that introduction, Miles. maybe I'll just say a little bit, also maybe more appropriate for this webinar. I participated both in the Net Zero and currently in the US tag for the carbon neutrality standards that we'll be talking about today. This on. So a very brief introduction to Omnex. I know many of you visit us regularly. There are also new people who attend. You know, who is Omnex? Well, we're headquartered here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we have global offices. Really, we help support Ford Motor Company in their emerging market strategy, in the 1990s. And also a little bit later, the semiconductor industry. Both of this, which just made us very global. I'll just say this, what we're very proud of as helping in the US and the world with all the different standards we write. Let's go on. This is a look at our global offices and global support. We are one of those unique organizations that are able to do this. Folks, just hang on 1 second here while I just do a little adjustment. The sun was shining directly in my face. I just wanted to sort of readjust this. These are the different markets we operate in. As you might imagine, being in Michigan, we're very much in the automotive industry. And because of the work we did helping the semiconductor industry, we have just about helped everybody in the semiconductor industry, from Intel to AMD to Analog Devices to you name the company, both fab and fabless. We do a lot of work in the aerospace industry. And of course, I'll just jump ahead here. A big part of what we're doing today is helping the automotive industry transition to the electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle market. Okay, a little bit about our services. Let me jump here. I saw the introduction that Miles did. It was really hard to, customize this for all the different areas of my own personal interest. So of course, very interested in these environmental standards. I'm on the TC 207. Not only did we help write 14001, but these standards are very, very important. What standards? Net zero. Net zero came out in time for all the different countries met. If you remember, they met in Egypt. It was called COP27. And this IWA free downloaded guidelines document. It's a good document. It is not 100% congruent with the carbon neutrality. I'll talk about that. So it came out back in the end of last year. And net zero is the concept and the term. I'll explain to you why as we go through here. That's going to get popularized. Carbon neutral, which is ISO 14068, which is in a DIS, Draft International Standard. It'll probably go from a DIS to a FDIS in the next meeting. And the countries are meeting in Costa Rica in about 1 or 2 months. This 14068 is a very important standard. It's about carbon neutral, and carbon neutral is a pathway to net zero. Why is net zero very important? We will talk to you about that in just a bit. So here's the outline. I'm not going to walk through all of this, but I'll start with definition. I can tell you right now, your head will spin with all the different terminologies here, because even though we care a lot about the environment, going into doing something like this, breaking it down to its different parts, making sure people play fair, that, what is the word to use? That people just don't declare themselves to be carbon neutral and net zero. They call it greenwashing. We don't want greenwashing. Everybody, both in the net zero was an international committee. Could you believe it? We met all at once. It was just mayhem. Carbon neutral is, of course, the US tag is, I'm working with the US tag, and it's making its usual ISO, progress. All right. So what is carbon neutral? Okay, here is a confusing, I want to see that this definition improves, but the idea there's no net emission. So idea is you have greenhouse gases, right? GHG emissions, you have removals. So removals minus emissions minus offsetting, it's got to be zero. That'll give you a carbon neutral. So you would say, oh, yep, that's easy. I'll just figure my carbon footprint, go to the market, I'll buy all these carbon credits, and I'll declare myself carbon neutral. But when you do this claim, there are requirements in the claim that you actually start reducing your emissions and you start doing your removals before you do the offsetting. All right. So that's the idea of this carbon neutral, that it's zero, meaning emissions minus reductions plus your offsetting equals, carbon neutral or zero carbon that you are sending out to the environment. But, we're all queasy about it. We're worried about this offsetting, and we're concerned that that's not so real. So that's the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. All right. So that's let me work towards that. I hopefully helped you understand carbon neutral. What is it? You'll have a boundary. It's called a subject, meaning the entity can pick a product that they're doing, and that would be called a subject. Or you could pick the whole entity, could be the subject. This is a word the standard uses, okay? So achievement of this condition is not limited to GHG emissions and removals within the boundary. It can include counterbalancing such as carbon offsets, as long as these meet certain criteria. Again, this is a really, really good team. It's written many different standards to get to where we are today, including the verification, what third party has to do to verify something like this. Note 2, carbon offsets are used after emission reductions and removal enhancements have been made in line with the carbon neutrality management. so that we're not doing a greenwashing by immediately offsetting right off to the bat, spending money just so that we can have, say something to the public. What is carbon neutrality? Wow, state of being carbon neutral. That told us a lot. Carbon neutrality claim. This claim is a public declaration, and of course, you have to make information available to the public, and I'll share that with you. What do you have to make available to the public if I do a good job in time management by the end of this webinar? So this is very important. You've heard it a million times, so this is old school. Carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is the amount of your emissions. So I'll introduce this right now. There's a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. 3 different scopes for emissions. And then you have to reduce them all. It's called removals of the subject. Remember, the subject can be the entity, or it could be even a product in the entity, for example. And what do? You express it as CO2 equivalent. So that's what carbon footprints are, okay? For a product, you can do it based on a life cycle assessment. There's a standard ISO 1467 that you can use. And this 1464 becomes really important because that's the one that came out in 2018 that spelled out the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. It was done so early, it still calls itself category. And what we all say, we call it scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And it spells out in detail, lots of guidance, folks, if we want to start on this path. All right. So carbon neutrality, what is it again? Emissions minus reductions plus offsets equals 0. Okay. All right. Now let's take a look at net zero. Of course, what can you not have in here? They do not want offsets. Okay. Condition in which human cost residual. So what they wanted to do is do anything possible. I mean, you have to do all the things possible to reduce your GHG emissions. Then what's left is what your sector, if you're doing automotive products, what's there when you take everything out, that's the residual emission. If you're a chemical plant, I mean, there are certain things that you're going to have as residuals, and that'll be based on what they call your sector. And then you'll have to do removals. And I'll explain the word here. It's right here. Human-led removals include ecosystem restoration, direct air carbon capture. You can actually capture and store it, reforestation. So something that you're doing to balance your emission. So when you do that, when you take down your emissions as low as you can go, and you balance it by human-led removals, then you can say, I am net zero. All right. So carbon neutral to net zero, are they congruent? Do they work together? Let's go on and find out in the next slide. Oh, I came up with definitions here. I explained this, but I thought this would be good. Residual emissions that remain after taking all possible actions, and then withdrawal of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere as a result of deliberate human activity. So you have actually made a plan and you're taking greenhouse gas, and that your residual emissions matches your withdrawal, boom, you are net zero. All right. Some of us like equations. Here's the equation. And of course, I asked the question, why is this not a minus? So I guess the idea is it's a negative minus a negative and becomes a positive. I'm so sorry, folks, to say things like that. But here is the GHG emissions. In carbon neutral, you have not reached your residual only, okay? You have other, emissions that you have that, you haven't come to this one here. Plus, you've started doing removals minus your offsets. What if that net result is a positive? Are we carbon neutral, folks? If that's anything greater than 0, then the net result, you're not carbon neutral. If you're 0, you're carbon neutral, meaning you got enough carbon offsets to offset your footprint, you are 0. You could be negative, and that's very good. That's also 0, okay? All right. So this is the equation in terms of, let me give you a chance, actually, maybe after this next slide, okay? So here is what's called a pathway. This is called a pathway. You'll see the word pathway. This means over time, what is your plan to become carbon neutral? And then, of course, you could go all the way to net 0, where the residuals equals the removals. Big discussion whether the removal offsets, human-led removal offsets outside the subject. That's why it's called, it's sometimes called it's enhancement, but it's outside your scope and boundary. Whether it starts, where is it? Whether it's, this one has to go to 0, okay? This reduction offsets, whether net 0 can start here or net 0 can start here, okay? We'll wait to find out. You can see here, I caught a small mistake in the standard and we'll correct it. Right soon after your top management announces its commitment, you don't immediately have offsets, and you become, if you have all the offsets that matches your neutrality, you could be 0 right there, okay? So to show it properly, we'll have to show the reduction offsets building up to when you're carbon neutral, okay? So imagine all this is not there. All right, let me pause here to see what kind of questions you may have. This is the important basis of the rest of this presentation, okay? The idea of the pathway from carbon neutrality to net 0. Let me pause here, give you guys a few seconds actually to do this. It is clear as mud, isn't it? I hope I did a little better than that. So if you look at this, you can think about the carbon neutral as it is a certification and a claim that you're making on the way to achieve net 0. So if you ask me, both of them work quite well together. All right, folks, I am not seeing any questions, and I am actually very surprised. Okay. Maybe nobody's listening to me that close. All right. So this is an excellent picture. Carbon neutrality actually starts here because why? Your GHG emissions, meaning including reductions, right? Removals are happening, and offsets equals 0. Okay. All right. Okay. Very good. So let's do a poll question here. Please rate your knowledge of carbon neutral and net 0. Is your organization, what is your knowledge? Number 2, are you moving towards carbon neutral and net 0? Why are you embarking on this program? I'll give you some time here. Answer it. What else you can tell me when I can proceed? Okay, I don't know. Does the audience see this? So we do have mediums and we do have experts. Okay, good. Wow, I'm scared now. Is your organization moving towards carbon neutral and net zero? 93% said yes. Wow. And do I have an answer for number 3, Miles?
I'm not seeing one.
Okay. All right. So let us move on then. So I think these principles are important. Remember, 2 different teams wrote this. I tried to, being a go-between between the teams, I tried to bring in some of the same principles on both sides. But the really important ones, so you can see what we are all concerned about. Number 1, well, it just happens to be there. This side is, left side is carbon neutrality, and right-hand side is in the net zero standard. Do you see the word transparency? Why is transparency important? Folks, of course, you can't answer. So transparency is so that it is clear to everyone exactly where you are. And number 2, that you're being honest, and that's transparency. Second, they'd like you to be conservative. They don't want you to make, in your calculations, everything is based on calculations. And as you can imagine, we have standards to help make sure you do the right calculation. It's one of the 14064 standards. So a conservative approach, because in the end of the day, it's really about saving the planet. Let me just, I'll share that with you in a second. Ambition. What kind of ambition do you have? What kind of ambition does your top management have? This is a big deal, and I'll bring this up a little bit later. It's something in all the different standards that deal with, carbon footprints. And then number 4, urgency. There's an urgency here. And then, of course, accountability. All right. Not only are we going to be using accounting standards, but there's accountability here in terms of what you claim. All right. So here we have the 2 different sides in terms of principles between the 2 standards. All right. Now, most importantly, when you embark on a program like this, you need top management's commitment. So if I didn't say this, let me say it now. One is a standard for certification, which is ISO 14068. One is a guidance standard. The net zero is a guidance standard. So it's filled with information where they feel that they're sharing with you on how to do things. All right. I did a mixture of both 14068 and IWA 43. IWA 43 is the name of the net zero standard. Okay. Number 1, we need to document a commitment statement from top management. It's like the policy, if you want to think of it, but it's really a commitment statement that then sets a framework for the carbon neutrality pathway and achieving. Now, here's the other big fear, because they want these removals. Remember, the key is the removals. In quality, we call it backsliding. If you remember in the PDCA cycle in Kaizen, you actually see the stepwise ladder, and then it goes down, right? Because you can't maintain it. So they're quite concerned of the permanence of the removals you have. So they want to set mechanisms, they call it mechanisms, in place to ensure that it can maintain over a long time. All right, so it sets a framework for setting a carbon neutrality pathway and achieving and maintaining whatever claim we make, carbon neutrality or net zero, is appropriate for the organization. You have to identify the scope and boundaries of the subject. Remember, I said the word is subject here, not entity. They just moved it slightly to, the entity can be the subject or may not be the subject. Establish an organizational structure, including a top management involvement. Yeah, what does top management do? Have to ensure that there's a carbon neutrality management plan and is integrated into the organization. And in quotes, the environmental management system. this is one of the recommendations that the US TAG is going to make. Even in TC 207, there are very few crossovers between the environmental management system, ISO 14001, into the carbon standards. There are a few of us who know both. So a lot of times when standards don't connect the dots, it's not because they don't mean to, it's because there aren't people who know both, okay? All right, ensures that the strategic direction and the context are aligned with the carbon neutrality plan. Ensures that resources are available, right? Important. Communicate, so top management needs to communicate the importance of emissions reduction and then continual improvement. And the whole idea is to continually reduce your offsetting, and you actually do it by improvements in the emissions. So here is some guidance from the IWA 43 on leadership commitment. So here's what they say: prioritize emission reductions. And using, so you'll see this way, see in E also you see the word science-based pathways, meaning in every sector there's recommendations on how to improve and how much should be a residual and what is achievable. They'd like you to set your targets based on that. Use alternatives to high greenhouse gas emitting processes, materials, practices, services. By the way, I saw Dave Watkins is in the presentation. Dave, ISO 50001 on energy efficiency is a great, plan to implement for management, because not only does it reduce a carbon footprint, it saves money. C, prioritize environmental integrity. So they want you to make sure you're not doing things to, for your reduction or your offsetting where you destroy the world. Require the counterbalancing of residual GHG emissions through high quality removals and storage. Include sector-specific science-based pathways and decarbonizing trajectories. As you all know, if you do a forestry project, I'll say this because I think you saw, I have planted 1,600 trees in my time. I planted 1,200 trees in my orchard here, apple orchard. I have about 950 left in my 11th year, okay? Some of them die in the first 5 years. Some of them, various things happen. People run over it with tractors. Crazy things happen where we damage 10 or 15 of them every year. Okay, so that's a normal thing to expect when you do these projects. So you have to put in, plan what you're going to do if you're going to do something like this. All right. Through appropriate high quality removals and storage, safeguard society, human settlement, blah, blah, blah. Let me go back here. Now here you're going to see that they want us to reduce the 50% of global emissions by 2030 and then reach a net zero by 2050. Why, you may ask? And I think I have that coming shortly, okay? In terms of what, what we may want to, why the standards, all standards want you to reach this kind of what they call the ambition, because we'll see here, okay? Move on here and ask this question. Why 1.5 degrees centigrade? I don't know if you saw that here. You don't actually, but you see it everywhere. I haven't put it in, but you see this idea of this 1.5 degrees centigrade. The reason is if we don't do anything, we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade, and you can see the kinds of things that can happen. I'm not saying I've identified everything here, but I just thought I'd tell you why net zero, not just carbon neutral. Why is net zero so important? Because the ice melts, seas rise, it englows into the land, people will lose their homes. 2 million square meters of permafrost is saved over centuries. 50% reduction in global population experiencing water scarcity. Okay, so quite a lot of people will experience water scarcity. You can see here, and see 50% reduction in species losing half the geographic range. So a tremendous loss to the earth as we know it. Folks, I don't want to get into climate arguments. I'm just a standards writer, and I'm just trying to help write the standards and help implement the standards. So here is the United States. We have announced that we're going to halve. So this 50% goal that we have in, as we say in ambition, there's a part of the standard called ambition. Cutting the greenhouse gas by 50% by 2030 is the US target, and to reach net zero by 2050, all right? So the US is the second largest emitter, and we have joined about 130 nations in the intention to act on climate change. And also, some of the largest US-based companies have committed to net zero. I can tell you, pretty soon, I don't know what all industries we're all in, you will see this just as quality came down, this requirement for net zero and carbon neutral will become a mandatory requirement as we go closer and closer into not meeting these targets. And let me just say one more thing here. I'm not going to read all this, but just to say, finally, China always had come on board. India has come on board, a fast growing economy with a GNP that just beat Great Britain in the number 4 place. So lots of arguments the arguments are between the developing nations and the developed nations. You know, we saw that argument coming from Rio de Janeiro. I forget, I think I was still in college at that time. I recall reading it and all the protests that took place. For all of us who are in ISO 14001, I don't know if you know, the countries could not agree. When they could not agree 30, 40 years ago, they agreed on creating Technical Committee 207. That's what they agreed to do as one of the actions, and ISO 14001 was written, okay? But today, is it going far enough? It's not going far enough, all right? So I thought I had, okay. So ambition, this is actually from ISO 14068. The standard, 9.2 is from the standard. The entity shall assess. So part of the assessment is the level of ambition of its carbon neutrality management plan, and provide an explanation and rationale for the choices made. They should address timing for achieving carbon neutrality, the capacity and responsibility of the entity to act, changes in response to new climate science information, and so on. And they say, see Annex D. I didn't pick the A part of D. I put the second part of D here. So all of D2, I have not put in here. Here's what they say. High ambition can be demonstrated by, for example, setting subject boundaries to all relevant GHG emissions. Don't scope something out that is really hard for you to do, but is your biggest Pareto. Achieving carbon neutrality for the whole versus a subject that's just a part of the organization. Achieving carbon neutrality for all the entity's products, planning and acting to achieve deep and fast GHG reductions and maximum possible GHG removals, and so on, okay? So this idea of ambition and top management's ambition was demonstrated through the carbon neutrality management plan. As you can see here, in 9.2, we assess it, and in the annex, they give us examples of what you could do. All right, leadership responsibilities coming out of the IWA 43, which is the guidance standard. Set and clearly define your boundaries. They want you to include something called scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. You don't know this yet. I have a slide coming on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Set targets for the organization to achieve net zero in the shortest time possible, no later than 2050, because 2050 is a magic day when we will hit greater than 1.5 degrees centigrade. And then that's mayhem. There'll be mayhem going on right up to that. Right now, I think we're at 1.2 degrees centigrade. Sets interim targets, prioritizes the organization's own emissions reductions removals, determines actions for GHG. So you could do removals outside your scope. They call it the subject, outside the subject, and you will turn that into offset. So that's a good removal offset that you're going to do. And that's the one we're debating, whether that is allowed in net zero definition or not. Common sense dictates it is, okay? Determines actions for GHG emissions reductions and determines actions for removals. Set an indicator so you're measuring how you're doing. One second here. Establishes and develops supply chain relationships, because scope 3 is about your supply chain. I haven't told you that yet. Share knowledge and experience for net zero with other organizations. Invest in meeting net zero targets. Commit to eliminating deforestation. Every time we lose forests, like for example, losing the Amazon, we are losing, we're adding to the global GHG numbers. Establishes, implements, and maintains a corrective action process to address deviation or failure to progress as expected. So you can see here then, I put more slides here than maybe as in the standard, it's just one section of the standard, but you cannot get to where you want to go without getting your top management on board and explaining things to them, okay? So let's talk about subject and its boundaries and the scope 1, 2, 3 in this next section. So I'm not going to explain entity. Organization is the definition for organization. You can see entity is the organization seeking to achieve and demonstrate carbon neutrality. And then a subject. So the entity and the subject can be identical, or the entity may be responsible for several subjects, several products, okay, that it manufactures. And each of the products could be a subject, and you may put different targets and different pathways for each of them. That's why you have the idea of subjects, okay? All right, entity and subject. Establish organizational boundaries. And these, each site may have one or more, as you know, sources of greenhouse gas and sinks. You could put sinks in to take greenhouse gas away from the environment. And then you have the idea of reporting boundaries, which is really a description and explanation of emission categories. And you're going to be reporting through these emission categories and your boundaries, okay? So the idea of reporting boundaries. It's really simple, but it's initially, it just sounds confusing. Just imagine reporting is a big deal, and the standard says you got to report in a certain way by your scopes, okay, emission categories. All right, simple. What is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? 1, what is my GHG emission? Meaning within the subject, gas emissions from sources directly owned or controlled by the organization. I'll tell you more about this a little bit later when I talk about targets. It'll explain what's in scope 1. Scope 2 is purchase energy, right? We all have to purchase electricity, gas. 3 is indirect emission from sources not owned. And you can think of that as your value chain, upstream, downstream, okay? And all of that is included as part of your scope 3 responsibilities. So let us take then a look at target setting. The carbon neutrality management plan and target setting as a very important topic. So I'm not going to cover all of this. I just wanted to give you an idea. In fact, it's a lot more I could have put in here. But basically, you need to have a plan for each subject. Now we know subjects, right? Each product, or it could be the whole entity. Starting with a commitment from top management to who is responsible for the implementation, the description of the subject, the baseline period. What is your baseline? And what is your plan? What is your overall carbon pathway? Okay, all right, I'll say that. And everywhere you go, you'll see the idea of emissions, removals, and offsets, okay? More or less, and then there's many categories of them. So the plan can target carbon neutral. Carbon neutral does not do enough. This ISO 14068 doesn't do enough to bring together net zero. You know, I'm going to suggest maybe we even say carbon neutral and net zero and put more of it in, because really net zero is the topic, is the catchword that's going to become super, super important for us. So what would they like us to do? Go to net zero and then do more removals than your residual. Go to negative carbon footprint. You know, how real, if I asked a question, maybe somebody can give me your thoughts in the Q&A. How real are these standard writers? So you got some true blue people from different countries, you know, there are hundreds of us writing standards, right? Who think that the organizations will, some organizations will go through a negative footprint. What are your thoughts? Can you put something in the chat for me or in the Q&A? I know we have some people here who have opinions on these things. What do you think? We'll give you a chance here. Will organizations, I'll ask you, will they stop at carbon neutral? Will they move to net zero? I think they're going to have to. I do believe it'll become a mandatory requirement. Okay, I see I'm already getting some responses. I'll take it up as a topic with the Q&A. And more people, please, give me your thoughts. And then that companies will go into negative. That the carbon emissions minus removals, your removals are greater than your carbon emissions. Folks, anybody else? Okay. All right, I'm getting more responses. Thank you very much. I am going to continue and I'll take it up in the very end, okay? So this is the idea of the all-important carbon neutrality management plan. I was thinking whether I should share with you all the documented information, maintain and retain that they want us to keep, because they do want to make sure you're transparent, that we are transparent for implementing it. We have indicators, we have the data to be able to see whether we're indeed meeting what we claim. So setting targets. So this is what 14068 says. Achieve a reduction in either absolute, meaning you can show that you help change the global GHG, or intensity in terms of just something, your product maybe. Specify the period of time for any GHG removal are achieved in relationship to the baseline that whichever year you're taking as your baseline. Reduce GHG emissions and then undertake. So you have to reduce emissions and then undertake GHG removals before offsetting. Okay, this is going to become part of, before you can claim carbon neutral, this is something they are going to expect that we do. All right, let's move on here. Let's look at what IWA, the 43 net zero says. Gosh, it's actually IWA 42. Miles, I don't know how, I'm so confused now. I do believe it's IWA 42, okay? I don't know how we didn't make that change. I hadn't asked for that change, but it's okay. All right, so here it is. Organizations should set targets consistent with 50% reduction by 2030. I explained why, right? It's the US goal. It's the world's goal because 1.5 degrees centigrade is going to cause havoc. Achieving net zero by 2050. Remember this, you cannot expect carbon neutral and an ISO standard to say something like this. You'd expect a guidance standard to say this. Net zero targets should include emissions related to all relevant GHGs, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Now you know what those scopes are, right? Scope 1, me. Scope 2, purchased energy. Scope 3, my value chain, upstream, downstream. Take into account all emission sources. By the way, ISO 14064-1 does a great job spelling out all the different types of emissions we need to take into consideration. It is what's going to be used by your registrar. All right, so take into account the total GHG emissions related to products and services consumed within the boundaries of the subject, and aim to counterbalance these through removals and offsets. So in addition to net zero, set additional targets for a neutral and positive impact on nature. You know, when we did the net zero, there are so many different nonprofit groups. We had a number of nonprofit groups also involved in setting net zero when we did the net zero standard, that you will see, it's not a bad thing, but you'll see the mentality of the people who help write the standards. They want to help the world, kind of, people who have dedicated their lives to helping the world. So this is not everything, folks. I added this just to tell you what, not only can you set targets like this. Physical means sort of manufacturing or chemical processing. What are the emissions coming out of it? What about transportation owned and controlled as part of scope 1? Intentional or unintentional fugitive emissions that's coming out, it's just the way it is. Generation of electricity, heat, or steam in boilers, furnaces, or turbines, okay? Then you have the indirect GHG emission from purchased energy. And part of this target there is to reduce your energy consumption. Use something like 50,001, the Energy Efficiency Management System standard. Or switch to renewables or low carbon, meaning non-fossil energy, okay? And then scope 3, you can see interesting things here. It's a list of 15 different things. You can see purchase products and services, any fuel energy not in 1 and 2, upstream transportation, meaning before it gets to your value chain and distribution, waste generated in operations, business travel, employee commuting. So you can see scope 3 includes a bunch. All right, so we are coming to the end here, and I need to also actually pick up carbon neutrality and net pathway. You saw this picture before to explain how you go from carbon neutral all the way to net zero. All right, so you need to have, this is the pathway with time, and with time you have to have actions in terms of what you're going to do. So here it is: reduce emissions by changes in consumption or elimination, substitution of high emission to low emission products, power usage, change your products, even make it less, in terms of interacting with the greenhouse gases. Prioritize GHG removals as withdrawals of GHG from the atmosphere by sink. And unabated, finally, all you'll be left with is, unabated does include the residual. So unabated is before you do the ultimate reduction. Can be offset or even offset earlier to achieve carbon neutrality. You can see here, this is net zero way early. We have a lot way to go, but we became carbon neutral, okay? All right. So what are the carbon neutral reports and claims? You can see here, the entity needs to make the following available. You need to make a carbon neutral report available. The description, of course, the subject and the boundary, rationale of selecting it, information on your neutrality management plan. I'm just going a little faster because of time, okay? Including targets, reduction strategy, time scale, and so on. And so your carbon neutrality has to be real. This is another thing they put in the standard, real. And I said, really? You're going to put the word real in the standard? Yes. It's a term that they use in these standards, is that it has to be real. A carbon neutrality claim shall be made only once all requirements are met, that you come up with an executive summary of the report. The external summary shall refer readers to the full text of the report. So if somebody wants to see something specifically, they know where to go. Consistent with the information in the neutrality report, is accessible, summarizes the scope and boundaries, states the carbon neutrality plan, states the amount of emissions, removals, emission reductions, and GHG removal enhancements, okay? These removal enhancements states the amount of carbon footprint that has been offset and more, okay? So these are the things, and you can see on top here, it has to be verified by a third party. All right, I just want to finish up with this, that the EMS has always, wanted to look at climate. And you can see here in the commitment to the protection of the environment that you see in the EMS policy, you can see provision of pollution and other specific commitments. You can see a protect the environment can include sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and so on, okay? So ISO 14001 has always been friendly and expected that there's one environmental management system in the organization. And the idea is, this is my last slide, that the carbon neutral and net zero plan can become a key environmental objective and can be a part of the EMS plan. The established EMS organization inside our many organizations, so we don't create all these silos, can be used to support carbon neutral and net zero. What do you all think about that? So I have a poll question. Is integrating with the EMS a good idea? And soon we'll go to the questions. I see now that we have quite a few questions. So most of you say yes. One person said no. Okay. Yeah, I can see, many good, reasons for doing it. And I'm possibly there's some reason for not doing it also. So maybe put that up for discussion. So with that, let me turn on to the questions. Let me just finish by saying, I think you all know, we do many different types of training courses here at Omnex. And let us take a look at the questions you have. I'm going to start with your discussion in the beginning. So here is, okay, I think a point. So somebody is suggesting that maybe there's something positive to be gained by going negative net zero, okay? And yeah, they have to think about it. I wonder if you go negative, if I'd like to sort of discuss it with the with my team members here in terms of, is there a carrot for going negative? So we have an opinion here that I don't think is doable for manufacturing companies to go negative. So all you'll have to do is go to the very least that you have. And then of course you have to do some kind of, sinks to take carbon. Some way you're taking carbon out of the environment. So that's part of what you'll have to do. You just do more, okay? And I don't know how much it's going to cost us to take carbon out of the, I'm going to think, I'm watching this show called Unstable. I don't know if you in Hulu, and this entrepreneur, Rob Lowe is playing it, I think. He's coming up with a way to make concrete blocks out of carbon in the environment. Okay. Or our entrepreneur, I mean, that's only a TV show. But right now, everybody's going bonkers because one of the things I didn't tell you is how many billions of dollars are going to be spent in terms of helping the environment, because otherwise a huge number of billions of dollars will go the other way. All right. I live in the north. Net zero will be a huge expense for us. Just going beyond doesn't seem realistic. Okay, fair enough. Organizations will do the least that they can. This is another one, and we're still meeting some standard. Okay, economics. Okay. Very hard because of management systems coordinating with all stakeholders, time management buying into it. So maybe this was for the why they didn't want to include it maybe in the EMS. And example of scope 1, I did several different examples of scope 1. Let me take that as a last question, answering that. And we'll finish up today's webinar. So here is scope 1. Emissions from manufacturing, that's called the physical, or chemical processing, transportation, intentional or unintentional fugitive emissions, generation of electricity, heat. So those are all the examples, okay? Folks, I hope you enjoyed the webinar today. I certainly enjoyed preparing this and sharing it with you. Very much hope we'd like to be a part of your journey to carbon neutral and net zero. So please, if you have, I'd love to get involved. I'd love to help explain this to your top management and help you implement it. Folks, with that, thank you very much for sharing this 1 hour with me. And I hope you got a lot out of it. And thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.